With both of these things put together, I'm wondering what you see as the direction of these conversations.
Well, Sonali, usually those kind of press conferences from President Putin do not these days generate many headlines. It is mostly for domestic audience. But this year, of course, is very different because we are in the midst of perhaps the most significant tense security situation in Europe at the moment. And in this context, of course, everyone is listening very carefully what President Putin had to say about his intentions and his plans vis-a-vis Ukraine and, of course, generally in the European security. And I think we can detect from his language today that he actually tried a little bit to de-escalate his rhetoric. Definitely compared with what we heard from him just a couple of days ago at the meeting at the Ministry of Defense, where Russia has been threatening military response if the West and NATO and United States do not provide Russia with guarantees that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. Of course, from the US perspective and the Western perspective, it is not the West, but it is Russia which is generating the current security threat by amassing more than 100, or some estimates even put it as high as 170,000 troops at the border with Ukraine. Of course, President Putin also mentioned in this clip that you just played that the US administration wants Ukraine to join NATO, while, of course, in fact, President Biden has been rather careful in what he was saying about Ukraine's membership. During the last NATO summit, he said that the jury is still out and it will take a long time for Ukraine to join NATO. So there is no urgency here. So Russia is really escalating the situation in order to secure these negotiations with the United States. And it is a positive development, of course, that the Biden administration is responding, that they're ready to sit down with Russia in early January to discuss those security guarantees, although it is unlikely that we're going to see any breakthroughs.
Oksana, can those talks happen with 100,000 troops on the border?
Well, I think, it is clear that the West will do everything they can, and both United States and, of course, Europeans as well, Germany and France, they want these talks to happen. They believe that, just talking will already help to reduce those tensions that at the moment are really at a very critical level. But the reality is that we have not seen any movement on the ground. The troops are still there. The preparations are still taking place, and various, security analysts are estimating that Russia perhaps will be ready for its military operation as soon as the end of January. Therefore, the situation remains very critical. So I think from the Biden administration, they will be watching carefully the fact that Putin did not threaten any further escalation in his press conference, and he signaled readiness to sit down and talk. So I think the talks will go ahead. But as I mentioned before, it is very difficult to see any breakthroughs because the positions are very diametrically opposed. Russia wants explicit, legally binding guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO, while NATO is saying very clearly that no such guarantees will be forthcoming.
Oksana, I'm wondering what the risk of an escalation is at this point.
Well, we still assess that the risk of full-scale Russian military offensive in Ukraine remains low. However, of course, we know in the past that this kind of escalatory dynamics can really take the logic of its own. And we see a lot of troops on the border. And of course, there's a lot of concerns that any provocation, any incidents, and we see those incidents happening almost on a daily basis. There are violations of ceasefire happening in eastern Ukraine. There's a lot of military activity in the Black Sea region at the moment. So any accident or incident can really spark this escalation incidentally. But I do not think that we are likely to see deliberate attack from Russia.
Oksana, we may not see a deliberate attack, but I thought that Ian Bremmer from Eurasia made an interesting point when he was talking to Bloomberg a little bit earlier on. He said they don't have to attack. All they've got to do is annex the Donbass region, and that gives them the buffer that they're potentially looking for. You don't even need to put boots on the ground to make that happen. Would that be one option, do you think, that Vladimir Putin might decide that he wants to pursue because it doesn't pose the risk of exposing his troops to some sort of conflict and the sanctions that could follow from that?
Well, first of all, it is important to say that Russia does have boots on the ground in eastern Ukraine, although, of course, Russia denies having those troops there. But all the OSCE observers and NATO and other experts, continue to insist that Russia does have troops on the ground. And I think the real strategy for Putin at the moment is not to annex Donbass, but actually to force the Ukrainians to secure a deal with those separatist regions in order to give those regions a veto over Ukraine's future foreign policy. And that is what Putin wants, because if Putin annexes Donbass, then Ukraine will be free to pursue its foreign policy, potentially even closer security cooperation. But as long as Donbass is there and able to influence the situation within Ukraine and destabilize the situation within Ukraine, this is what counts. Therefore, it's unlikely he'll annex Donbass separately
Oksana,
from the overall strategy.
I'm really curious about your thoughts on the strategic positioning here for President Biden, especially given the broader strategic alliance here that Russia and China have.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is very important that this press conference that President Putin specifically mentioned, not only that Russia has very close relationship with China in sort of strategic and economic sphere, but also in the military sphere. And I think he knows very well that this is a leverage he can apply vis-a-vis the Biden administration, which is seeking to refocus its attention away from Europe, but more to Asia. And while in Europe, of course, the Biden administration sees Russia's action vis-a-vis Ukraine as a threat, in Asia, they want to cooperate with Russia to contain China's rise. And they would want to make sure that there is a constructive dialogue with Russia on China and that Russia doesn't supply military technology to China, which Russia is doing at the moment.
Final quick question from me. Europe is experiencing a gas crisis, an energy crisis right now, Oksana. How do you think Vladimir Putin is going to play it over the next couple of months?
Well, I think it's interesting that the gas crisis has been discussed a lot today at the press conference. And what President Putin was saying, that Russia has nothing to do with the current gas prices in Europe, doesn't really hold very much water, because I think most of the experts agree that Russia is applying very deliberate strategy of pressuring Europe to certify Nord Stream 2 pipeline as soon as possible. And therefore, it is reducing the supply of gas via Ukraine, where it could have supplied substantially higher volumes. It's also reducing the level at which it is pumping gas into Gazprom's own storage facilities within Europe, and therefore, keeping all this pressure on the European gas market that potentially we will see shortage later on this winter. So Russia is playing this game, but I think it is going to be counterproductive, because Russia has now really secured a lot of attention to this issue of manipulating gas prices, manipulating its gas supplies for geopolitical ends. And therefore, it is likely that Nord Stream 2 certification actually is going to be delayed. So we now hear from a German regulator that it's unlikely to be certified before summer, and therefore it is likely to continue to see a lot of turbulence this winter, particularly if this winter is cold, and Russia will continue to play its gas card.